All right, Joel, here we are. Let's do our music first.
Sounds good. You're listening to Rhythms of Grace, a podcast of Grace Fellowship Church in McClenny, Florida, with pastors Nathaniel Simmons and Joel Griffiths. You can find out more about Grace Fellowship Church at www.gfcbaker.org. Hello and welcome to Rhythms of Grace. I almost forgot the name of the. I almost said Grace Fellowship Church, but we're not at church.
Yeah,
So
well,
welcome
we're connected.
to our more weekly thing that we've been doing, Pastor Nathaniel and I, of reviewing the sermon from Sunday. So Sunday was 2 days ago now, and it's been a good time. I've enjoyed doing this, and since Nathaniel was in the pulpit this week, I'll be the one kind of going over things and asking him some questions, digging in a little more to what the sermon process looks like and all the different thoughts that go into preparing a sermon. So, and it'll be a good way of just reviewing the content of the sermon this week. So, your title this week was Via Dolorosa, and I'm interested to know kind of how you came about titling it that, and just remind us what that means and stuff like that.
Well, I tried to twist your arm into singing Sandy Patty for us. So all the true Sandy Patty fans out there will be disappointed that you didn't do it. I don't remember where that idea first popped into my head. I don't remember anybody else using the words Via Dolorosa, but every commentary connects it to the final March of Jesus. However, it's the Via Dolorosa song is mostly by Sandy Patty, is mostly focusing on the time from Pilate until he goes to the crucifixion. And this passage would be actually starting at the Garden of Gethsemane and the Mount of Olives until that time. But it's still that same pattern. And so, I don't know, just Sandy Patty popped in my head, and I thought, that'll be fun.
Yeah.
And
So you had those parallels between David in this story and Jesus in his suffering. The Mount of Olives is mentioned. You mentioned the brook Kidron.
yeah.
They're both betrayed. They are taunted while they're on the way. We see the forgiveness of their enemies. They forgive their enemies. And then you just mentioned an overall sense of meekness that we see in David and in Christ. And that's those are some pretty interesting parallels, to be sure. And it's one that maybe not a lot of Bible readers, including myself, unless I were to go to like commentaries, I don't know that I would pick up on all of those. And so I guess I take that as a reminder of it is good to read the Bible in community, and not just in a community of like your own friends, but the community of the church at large, because people have been reading the Bible and reflecting on it for a long, long time. And the Holy Spirit has been leading people in reflecting on the Bible, Christians particularly, for a long, long time. And it's good to draw from that wellspring, I guess, of truth.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think some of those things I might have picked up on, right? But certainly not all of them. I have a list in front of me right now by Peter Leithart, who wrote a commentary on the book, and he has 7 things listed that are comparisons, and several of them I didn't even mention, but the connection between the ark and Jesus's suffering beginning when he leaves the temple. Ittai, the Gentile is with him, is described with him, and Joseph of Arimathea is with him. So is just the relationship of the Gentiles that carry the cross, Simon the Cyrene and Joseph Joseph of Arimathea, and the Gentiles that are with him, David as he's leaving. Ahithophel hangs himself. Now we haven't gotten there yet, but that's the betrayal that we're going to see. But later, we know that the person who betrays Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane goes and hangs himself, right? So, I mean, I feel like I only scratched the surface of some of these parallels. I think I was talking to Miss Wanda Sue yesterday. I'm trying to remember who it was that I was talking to. But there's something about the Bible that is... People ask, well, what makes you so confident that the Bible's the Word of God? And we did a little conference at Glen Baptist the other day, and I got to be in a question and answer. And we go through all of these things like, well, here's our manuscripts, and here's how old they are, and this is why we believe it's all reliably translated. And those are all good and helpful. But honestly, for me, it's like, just read it. And yeah, you'll see that. Not that I'm like crazy smart, but I do have a PhD. I could have never done this, right? And the guys who are said to have written the New Testament are fishermen and tax collectors. I mean, they're not scholars. And I'm not saying that I'm smarter than them. Maybe they're way smarter than me, but still, like this is like writing history for thousands of years in a way that aligns. I just don't see how these kind of parallels could be so woven together without it just being a reflection of the hand of God that does it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Just let it speak for itself. Just read the Bible and see if it doesn't strike you as compellingly true.
Yeah.
So that's good. I like that. So getting into more of just focusing not so much on the parallels with Christ, as interesting as those are, but specifically, what are these the stories about? So you read a lot more than you preached from yesterday. So you read kind of from the middle of 15 into the middle of 16. Excuse me, but and that was because all those verses that you read are 5 different interactions with different people that David has on his way out of Jerusalem. So he interacts with 5 different people, and you kind of see there, I guess, a unit that is kind of all supposed to be together, and so you wanted to keep that together, I guess, but at the same time recognizing you wouldn't have enough time in one sermon to cover it all unless you really, really stripped some things down. But kind of talk about how you thought through that.
Yeah, that was actually kind of hard. Every week I go longer than I intend to. So I knew that I would this week because this passage was super long. I mean, it took me a long time just to read the passage all by itself. And that was like, I don't remember, but I would assume that was 5 or 6 minutes of the sermon was just reading the text. So I'm like, if I cut half of the text out, I could get done a lot faster. But I kept it because of a couple of things. I do, like you said, I think it all goes together as one story. But there is an argument that I'm making at the very beginning of the sermon that the whole text is meant to be a reversal of the Exodus, or it's being pictured this way, so that David is functioning as his leaving Jerusalem is the opposite of the Jews entering Jerusalem. And I think you see that in several different ways, some of what was in our passage, and I mentioned it, but also the fact that he ends at the Jordan River. The very last line of verse 16 is, now they get to the Jordan River and they're exhausted and they rest there. And That was in 1613, I believe. They arrived weary at, or 1614, I'm sorry. They arrived weary at the Jordan. And that's just another sign for me that this is the Jews go from the Jordan to the Promised Land, and he goes from the Promised Land to the Jordan. And I just wanted that whole picture to be there for us. That, yeah, this is, it's like all of God's promises are becoming undone in this story. And I see all of that imagery tied together. I think that it's history, but I think there's a level of poetry in it, or symbolism. And I didn't want to cut out some of that poetry so that it would, I wanted it to be at least in the background so we could be picking up on it as we went through.
And I forgot to mention why David was leaving Jerusalem. So Absalom has been, politically manipulating things in such a way to get the people on his side. And he has gotten quite a following for himself, it seems. And he's basically coming back to Jerusalem to take over as king, right?
Yeah.
And David,
right.
And David makes the decision to leave Jerusalem. And you talked about whether or not that was a good decision or bad decision. Should David have left like he did? Should he have stayed and fought instead? And you mentioned people see things that in different ways. What are some of the, I guess, reasonings that go into each side of that question? Like, what are people, people who say it was good, why do they say that? People who say it was a bad decision, why do they say that?
So a couple weeks ago, when I was preaching through Absalom, I'd already kind of framed it in my mind that Absalom and David are going to be held up as comparisons, and that Absalom is a picture of arrogance and there's no meekness in Absalom, and that David is going to be presented as the meek one. And even though that David walks through suffering, he is the one that God stays with, because it's not success that proves Absalom's rightness. It's meekness that proves David's rightness, and that God is with the lowly, basically. So that was already in my mind, and I was just framing this as I walked into it as, oh, well, this is clearly good, right? David's the good guy, and Absalom's the bad guy. And I was mentioning it to Kara, my sister-in-law, who loves the story of David, and she said, I've always thought of David's flight as a cowardly act, right? He doesn't know if Absalom even has an army. He's been kind of working behind the scenes, and maybe David could have just gone and put his thumb down on his son and said, you're not going to do this, and stop the whole thing before it got started. And I thought that was really interesting because it was different than the way it was framed in my mind. So last week I did a little bit broader reading, and I noticed that A.W. Pink, for instance, was really emphasizing the weakness of David. That this is another time David seems to be afraid to stand up to his children, and we have seen that before.
Yeah.
And so that's when I started wrestling with it. Almost every modern commentator believes that David was rightly understanding that he had lost control, and that if he hadn't done this, it would have put Jerusalem into a risky situation, put the tabernacle into a risky situation, and that what he did was for the best of the country. I kind of left...
Not to tie things to any current events.
Yeah, right, right. Sometimes you get so weak and you have such a hard time lifting your feet that you should just step down. All right, let's pause on that, which reminds me later of another current event joke I tried to pull out that I felt like didn't quite make it in the sermon. I made a little Secret Service joke in it.
Yeah.
Some
grooves.
Slope roofs and stuff like that. So political jokes, take them or leave them, I guess.
Yeah, you just never know. That's the thing about, kind of, and I don't know if that was written into your sermon necessarily or not, but sometimes I'll have jokes kind of written in, and, you never know how they're going to go. And
I didn't write it into the manuscript. I thought about it, in that morning as I was kind of preparing. So it wasn't written in, but it wasn't off the cuff either. But anyway, political jokes, they're fun. So I say all that to say, Kara made me kind of go back and think about it from a different angle. I still lean toward the idea that David needed to leave. However, now I feel like the text doesn't say one way or the other with absolute clarity. Yeah. It doesn't criticize him, though. And whether or not he should have stayed or should have gone, I still believe it's clear that what transpires from the time he leaves to when he comes back is a contrast between him and Absalom, and David is the picture of meekness that God accepts, and Absalom is the picture of arrogance that God will humble him.
Yeah, it's in a context where David is presented as the good guy, to put it in simplistic terms. And I mean, if you think about parallels to Christ, I mean, nobody would say that Christ was doing the wrong thing by going to Calvary. So maybe there's something to be said there. But
yeah, and like Christ sat in front of Pilate and people made accusations and he wouldn't answer them. Which I think you could say, well, that's what's going to happen later with Shammai, or however you say his name. But even just the willingness to leave, I don't know. I guess if I had to take a side, I feel that David's gentleness here is on display in a way that is a model throughout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, so then you talk about the first two interactions that he has.
Yeah, so he's going to have 5 total, right? And we only got through 2 of them.
Yeah.
But there's 3 good guys and 2 bad guys, and we'll save the 3 for later. But that's the other thing worth saying, is that they're 5 snapshots. And that's what's hard, is because they're just individual pictures that are like 5 pictures laid out on a table, and your job is to say what connects these pictures. Why? Right? So you just did you did our little yearbook, and so you have pictures and you lay them out on a page. And there's some reason why you believe that those pictures belonged on that page.
Right, yeah.
Now, you usually give us clues. You have a heading or a title or something, like all the baptism pictures are on the same page, and all the pictures of Doug are on this last page. And so I can figure those out. And here there wasn't really a title that says, this is why these 5 pictures go together. But I felt like that was my job, was to ask, why these 5 pictures?
Yeah.
Right? So anyway, let's get into the 2 of them.
And I'll go ahead and say kind of what your general point was about each of these 5 is that they're telling us 2 things, basically, or showing us 2 things. They're showing us the meekness of David and the provision of God. And I think if I heard you right, you think each one of these indicates those things in some way, the meekness of David and the provision of God. So first you have Ittai the Gittite from Gath, and what was his deal? How did
Ittai the Gittite is the one that
I'm actually blanking on some of the specifics of his.
Yeah,
story,
Ittai the Gittite is the one that I love the most, and probably took me the longest to kind of put the pieces together on it. He's cool, right? He's just, first off, like his name, I like to say Ittai the Gittite. I think it's fun. The Cherethites, Pelethites, and the Gittites are some sort of bodyguard group that they're Gentiles, but they're in the personal guard of David. So he has the Israelite army that he controls, but that's mostly led by Joab. But these foreigners basically somehow serve as his guard. And Ittai, it was just the Cherethites and the Pelethites in chapter 8, but Ittai comes with the Gittites recently. We don't know how recently. It says only yesterday, and that's probably hyperbole, but very recently. And they're all marching out, and David says to them, like, y'all don't have to get thrown into this. Basically, this is a family battle. and y'all don't have to be a part of it. You could stay back in Jerusalem, and you'd be much more comfortable. Y'all are all exiles anyway. Like you've fled your homes, you've came for some level of security, and now you're going to run back into the wilderness and live in the woods with me, like living, in hiding again. And he says, I just don't want you to have to go through that again. And it's really a kind offer. When I read this, my mind immediately goes to how cool Ittai's response is, right? And so my focus in the early chapters was, the early kind of writing and thinking through this was to highlight the goodness of Ittai's response and to say, man, if you're a Christian, you say, no matter what comes, I'm with Christ. And I thought of like Peter, who said, all the other people were around and they were leaving because Jesus was teaching hard teachings. Yeah. And Jesus looks to his disciples and says, are y'all going to go too? And Peter says, where would we go? Who else has the words of eternal life? And I looked at Ittai as being like that, a guy who says, everybody else can go. Your whole country can leave you, but I know who the real king is, and so I'm staying with them.
Yeah, that's good.
And
Verse 21, Ittai answered the king, as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king shall be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be.
Yeah. And I still think that's good. I still think it's true and right. And like if I had put that in the sermon, I would have not been like, well, that's wrong. But as I started reflecting on my belief that this is a reflection of the Exodus story in reverse, right? And so they're going back into the wilderness. And once that became more of a controlling idea for me, that's when Deuteronomy 8 came in. And Deuteronomy 8 says, all suffering is meant to humble you, right? And to show the Lord's provision for you. Also, Psalm 3, David writes Psalm 3 about this experience. And he writes basically, my enemies are welling up, but God's providing. Salvation belongs to the Lord. That's his response. And so that's when I started thinking, wait a second, is this maybe not the things I just said about Ittai, but more centrally a display of the humility of David and the provision of God, that God will save you. And I started seeing at that point that Ittai is honorable in his response, but he's also the provision of God. Mm-hmm. In spite of the fact that David didn't manipulate him or twist his arm or say, you know what, God, or you've got to be here. He says, I'm going to just trust God, and God's going to provide. And in that sense, he's doing what the Israelites were supposed to do. They grumbled over the manna, and God says, no, I'm giving you the provision you need. Not necessarily the provision you wanted, right, but the provision you needed. And now I'm starting to see that David he's not grumbling at who he's lost. He's humbly receiving what God has given him. And it's an incredible gift that God gives him in Ittai. Mm.
That's good. Very good. Yeah, I like the honesty of David in dealing with Ittai, to say, this isn't something you have to be a part of. This is something that's not going to be fun, in all likelihood. And, he's seeking the best for Ittai and his group, not just trying to use him for his own purposes. Which is cool.
Yeah.
Contrasting it with the, political maneuverings of Absalom, who kind of pretends to care about people so they'll vote for him, basically.
What did you think about this? So this was the way my mind was working. I already believe humility and meekness are a major part of it. And then I'm seeing honesty as kind of what I respect about him. And so then the question in my mind becomes, what's the correlation between honesty and humility? Right. Yeah. And that's how I said, well, actually, there's a kind of honesty that is meekness.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I like the way you kind of defined meekness in the sermon. You said it's the quality of describing yourself as you really are, or something to that effect. Like you're not sugarcoating who you are, or trying to minimize your own faults, but you're just. What I took from it was you're real about yourself. You're You don't put on any kind of mask or try to deceive people and make yourself look better than you really are. You're just real. And would you add anything to that? Is meekness and humility the same thing? Would you say?
I think meekness.
There's got to be some overlap.
Yeah, I think probably meekness is a subset of humility. So meekness is being humble implies meekness. Meekness is most famously displayed in Moses when Aaron and Miriam are attacking him. He's the only one receiving the word from God, and he just needs to quit. He's not doing a good job, and God is like not happy with them for accusing him, and so he strikes them. He strikes Miriam with leprosy, and says, "Y'all, Moses is the meekest man on earth because he won't defend himself, but I'll defend him." And so God does it, and then Moses prays that Miriam will be healed, and God says, He says, if her dad would have spit on her face, right, then at least she would have had to stay outside the camp for a few days. Let me discipline the woman, basically. Like, it's okay that I'm coming to your defense. He doesn't destroy her, but he does inflict her for, I think, 7 days, if I remember right. But anyway, the whole point there was Moses accepted criticism, even false criticism, without becoming defensive there. And that was a display of his humility, but it was meek in the sense that it's not defensiveness. It's a willingness to be laid open and to be criticized without having to always guard his reputation in every single way. And so to me, I viewed that as an aspect of his humility, as opposed to everything that is entailed by humility.
Gotcha.
A few weeks ago, I shared that meekness is like gentleness, but it is the inward quality to which gentleness is the outward expression. So that if you're a meek person, that expresses itself to others in gentleness. You don't try to dominate people. You treat people gently. I'm
reminded of C.S. Lewis's definition of meekness or humility. I can't remember what word specifically, but he said it's not about thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. So almost it's like, I don't have time to think about myself because I'm thinking about other people. I'm so geared toward and oriented toward thinking about other people. So it's thinking not less of yourself, but of yourself less.
Good.
Anyway, next episode is.
Let me say real quick before you go
sure.
on. This will make you feel embarrassed, maybe, but David. One of God's provisions to David was Ittai as a friend, and I almost threw you in there, Joel. But there have been times in my life where I felt like you were the Ittai for me to sit and talk with me through things that were hard and just be a friend. And that I hope that I don't think every single one of our members will think, yeah, Joel's been that for me, because you can't do that for 100 people in the same way you've done it for me. But I hope everyone has friends like that and are friends like that to people. If you have a friend that has been there for you when you've been down, I think you can understand why that is the provision of God.
Yeah, amen. And that feeling is mutual, my friend.
Good.
So to use the emoji I often use in these moments.
Did you know if you do that on FaceTime now that it throws up hearts? Like,
really?
There's physical gestures you can do that create that. Yeah, but the girls love it. Anyway.
All right, so next is Abiathar and Zadok. Now, I don't know, you may pronounce the first guy differently, but...
I said Abiathar, but I don't know that it matters, or I don't know that there's a right.
No. So these are priests that are with David, and they're going along with him, and they make a stop somewhere, and David sort of tells them something similar to what he tells Ittai. He tells them to to stay, right, or to go home.
Yeah.
And what I mean, would you say a similar point is being made there, but just in reference not to, the Gittites, but the priesthood itself? That David's not even going to try to, take the priesthood with him, or the ark of God that they carried. And yeah, you did get into that some, made some really good points there, but I guess just speak in general about this episode.
Yeah. Again, I think, man, and if you're trying to mount a defense and a comeback, right? Having these guys on your side would be so powerful, right?
Yeah.
And the same way, if like the Cherethites, Pelethites, and the Gittites made up a third of David's army later on in the story, and to be willing to get rid of them, or at least a substantial portion of them, and now to get rid of the endorsement of the priests and the ark, what David is willing to let go is, it almost reminds me of Gideon. I believe it's Gideon, where he has this huge army and God takes him down to the brook,
too
and
big, make it smaller.
Yeah, like he's whittling them down for the point of showing it is in your lowness that I am saving you, David.
And my mind just keeps going back to Absalom and contrasting it with him, because he's this politicker, who's doing everything he can to get everybody on his side, and David's like doing everything to get everybody off his side.
Yeah. In Deuteronomy 8, like, so much of me wanted, there were a handful of passages that I thought, man, we just need to read this whole thing. Deuteronomy 8, Psalm 3 went along with it. A good part of Romans 8 went along with this. And then obviously the whole march of the cross from Gethsemane to the cross, that was too long. But here in Deuteronomy 8, I'm thinking that the second half of Deuteronomy, in the first half of Deuteronomy 8, he says, I'm bringing you out of the wilderness to humble you and to show you that I'll save you. And the second half of Deuteronomy 8, he says, and be very, very careful that when you go into the land, you don't forget that it was me all along that saved you, because you'll begin to think that you've acquired these riches for yourself and that you've raised up these defenses yourself, that you have saved yourself by your power. And he says, if you start to do that, A, you'll go after other gods, and B, I will humble you. I will come back and bring you down so that you can see that salvation belongs to the Lord and doesn't belong to anyone else. And I do kind of wonder if some of this David has gotten to Jerusalem, and he's in his palace, and God says, I just don't want y'all to think that you were saved because David was strong, right? Like, Israel didn't get here because of the strength of David. And so what I'm going to do is kick them back out and whittle them back down and let somebody else that's strong take Jerusalem, and then save you again, just to make sure that you understand how weak you really are and how strong God really is. And I wonder if that's this whittling that's happening, where he is willing to get rid of his army. He does lose the entire Israel army, and he's willing to send Zadok and all the Levites back.
Yeah. And I liked the points you made about not using God in a way that, to get the things that you want. Like, you tied that in, that using the Lord's name in vain, which we often think is, means don't say GD or OMG or whatever. But really it's taking the Lord's name in vain and using it for your own purposes, saying God is on my side here because he told me this, or he wants me to do this, or wants us to do this. Kind of using God as a power tool.
That's right.
And
in seminary, girls would talk about guys who would tell them God told them to marry them.
Yeah.
And they're like, they want to trust these guys. I mean, they're studying to be pastors, but they're like, God hasn't told me that. And I don't know. I just always thought, how reckless to tell somebody, God told me that you're supposed to marry me. I find it to be lacking the kind of meekness that this passage would call us to.
To be fair, a lot of girls have broken up with guys because God told them to.
That's right. That's right. That's right. All people are tempted to use God as their scapegoat.
Yeah.
Or power tool.
So how would you say, I'm looking back over this, I see how it shows David's meekness for sure, because he's not going to take this power for himself, or try to manipulate God, or pretend like God's on his side necessarily. How would you say it shows God's provision?
So, great question. Now, some of that, you just have to wait and see. I mean, I can just give you the heads up. But this story and the next one are going to put Zadok, Abiathar, and then this guy named Hushai back into Jerusalem. And they're going to be, Hushai the Archite. Those three guys are going to go back, and they're going to basically be the opponents of Ahithophel. And so God's going to provide through them. And so some of that's going to become more obvious as the story goes along. And you're going to see that in some more stark example there in...
Cool. Well, we won't spoil it then.
Yeah. But I will say this. I think that part of it is simply that David understands that the Ark of the Covenant will not save me. God will save me.
Yeah.
And
right, yeah.
This is another thing I really wanted to point. Man, there's so many things that just didn't make it because of time, and I still was fairly long. In Psalm 3, he says that all these enemies have risen up against him, and he is needing salvation. Everybody says there's no salvation for me in God. And he says, but I've cried out to you, and you have answered me from your holy hill. And I do think that there is something that I've missed. I think we preached on Psalm 3 already, and I didn't even catch this there, that you might expect that God would answer him from his holy hill when David lived on the holy hill. But what happens when David is in the wilderness and God is on his holy hill? Will God still hear him there? And so part of the story, I think, is that you don't have to be at the temple. You don't have to be in Jerusalem. Or at the tabernacle at the time for God to hear your prayer. So God's provision happens basically at a distance, right? David is in exile by the Jordan River, or running to the Jordan River away from the city of God. And God still on his holy hill hears them. And I think for the original readers, you got to think they're exiles in Babylon. And they've got to be asking, well, okay, have we lost God then, right? We're not in the city of God. The temple is destroyed. Later on it'll be rebuilt, but we don't have a temple. We're not in the city. We don't have a king. Does that mean God can't hear us? Does that mean God can't provide? And this is a reminder for them. No, the provision of God does not come from location or furniture. God's holy hill isn't actually even Jerusalem. Jerusalem is just a symbol of the holy hill of God. It's just this temple, and that mount is not where God lives. It's the symbol of where God lives. But God can answer you from his holy hill even when you're in McClenny, right? And there is no temple in Jerusalem right now, and God can still answer you from his holy hill. And I think that's part of what is being demonstrated here. But you have to bring Psalm 3 in probably to understand that side of his thinking.
Well, that's good. And if there's, unless you want to say something else about those, I'll kind of talk about the way you brought it to a response.
No, let's do that.
And so you just pointed out that Christians do suffer, and we suffer on purpose in the sense that God has purposes in our suffering, and we don't have to fall into this this mindset of thinking that God has abandoned his promises or thrown us out, but that he actually ordains the sufferings that we go through for our ultimate good. And I thought that was powerful reminder.
Yeah. Well, I recommended that book by Johnny Erickson Tata, and just talking through what it was like for her to come to and realize I can't use any parts of my body other than my head, right? And asking herself over time can I be thankful for this? Right? God says, give thanks in all circumstances. Should I be thankful that I'm a paraplegic and that I live in a wheelchair and has lived in a wheelchair for over 50 years? And she concludes over time, yes. One of the reasons I like her book so much is there's a time in her life where she thinks, yes, God will use this to reach the world, and God does use it to reach the world. But as she grows in maturity, I think she begins to recognize, no, actually God used this to reach me. And yes, he influenced other people as well. But she begins to think a lot of this was that I got to know God in my sufferings, and that was for my good. And she says, I'm thankful for that. And I so deeply want to be that type of person that if I'm exiled from Jerusalem, metaphorically, and I have to walk back through the wilderness, that I will be able to say, thank you, God. I believe that whatever you're doing is good and right, and that I won't fall into bitterness because I don't have to know even where I'm going, right? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil because I believe that he is with me. And I just want that to be so deeply written in me that no matter what I go through, I can say God will provide. And that just shaped my personality.
Yeah. And I think if you consider the alternative of, there is no purpose in our suffering, that is, it may be kind of theologically difficult sometimes for people to think that God might have purposes in bad things that happen, and does have purpose in suffering. But like, if you consider the alternative, okay, there is no purpose in it. That's pretty much too much to bear in my mind. Like the fact that, my suffering would be purposeless, that's like depressing beyond what I can even handle. So like there's so much more comfort in the fact that, no, there's a personal God who loves me and that sees and knows the future more than I can even imagine, and he loves me and he works all things for my good. And I can trust that, even if I can't connect all the dots or do all the math on this side of eternity. There will be a day when, we sing that Phil Wickham song, "Hymn of Heaven," where he says, all the prayers we prayed in desperation, we'll look back and see that those times were worth it. And so, that there is a lot more joy and comfort to be had in that than saying, oh, well, it's just, these things are just random. They happen, outside of any purpose of God. I can't go there, and I wouldn't want anybody else to either.
Yeah, there's a guy named Bertrand Russell he's a philosopher who wrote Why I'm Not a Christian, Atheist Attack Christianity. And he does say kind of famously that we will never be honest with ourselves until we give in to the reality that this life is built on unyielding despair. He says, your life is meaningless, it's a cosmic accident, and it's headed to utter destruction with no thing or person or entity in the world that will remember anything that happened for all of eternity. So for one little brief blink of an eye, there's consciousness that was here and will be gone, and it doesn't mean a thing. And he says, until you understand that, you'll never be an honest, intellectually responsible person. And I think, oh my goodness, that is unyielding despair, and he's honest about it.
About honesty and intellectualism, if that's the truth about the world.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I do respect the honesty of it, but I just don't believe it, right? I just don't
Yeah.
believe that nothing matters.
I assume he didn't actually live like that. And that's the reality of so many who would say that that's the way the world is. They don't actually live as if that's the way the world is.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know his biography very well.
Yeah. But anyway, God's purposeful even in our suffering, and ultimately, what we can say in the face of suffering is that God was willing to enter into it through His Son.
That's really good.
And so, I mean, that's the ultimate proof that He cares and that He loves us, and that He was willing to enter into our sufferings in order that we might ultimately be restored.
Yeah. The challenge of this passage has been that there's so many awesome things to talk about. You've got to pick one of them. But what you just said, honestly, is the one that sits highest in my heart right now. Like, there's a million cool things, but ultimately that God loves His people, and that whatever He allows you to walk through, He does it out of love and a desire to do good for you. And for that reason, your life has meaning and purpose and hope. And I don't know, that feels like enough to wrestle with and to hold on to carry you through the day and the week and a lifetime, really.
That's a good sermon's worth right there.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
All right.
Any other thoughts?
No, I do agree with you. The Hymn of Heaven was a great song. I'll be interested to what you do next. One of the issues that we're kind of running into, and you do this with a lot of narratives, is that there's a level of repeat that's going on. This idea, so we could have gone back to this thing we've asked before. Does the sinfulness of David nullify the promises of God? Because he's in exile, he's leaving the promised land. And we've said before, no, let God be true, though every man be a liar. And so you're going to have that same challenge as finding another song or another group of songs with some of the same great theology.
Yeah. There's a handful of songs that could be sung every week as you're preaching through 2 Samuel.
Yeah.
But obviously we don't want to sing the same songs every week, so
yeah,
try to mix it up some. And
you can do a fair amount of repeat.
At the end of the day. Yeah.
I think it was John Wesley who he made a hymnal for the Methodists, and he said that they only had 68 hymns, and he said you can't add any more until you master these. He said, I want these deep in your heart. And I feel like John Wesley was a little excessive in some ways, but it's okay to do a handful of repeats. I really love that Hymn of Heaven song we did. That was really good. Yesterday was great. A lot of great songs. How Great Thou Art, right? We did that yesterday.
Yep.
That was good.
2 days ago.
Oh, yeah, 2 days ago. Hey, I'm having fun. Oh, I'll just add this before we start signing off is, you know what? Maybe I'll do the
outro music.
Oh, but I don't have the outro music in here, so we'll just not have outro music for us. But I was going to say, the book club, we talked about reading the Johnny Erickson titled book. We haven't decided exactly what we're going to do with that, but we'll figure out some way to make some content with us talking about it, maybe pull in somebody else and allow for some sort of conversation coming up. But I think that if you want to grow in your view of suffering, that might be something I'll throw out one more time, is consider reading that book with us over the course of the next month or 2 months, at least through the end of August and maybe September as well. We'll be working through that book.
The quarterly book spotlight.
Yeah, we decided it was too much to do a book a month and to try to really digest them in depth. So we're going to slow down and do 4 books a year or so. Because you're reading other things too. But you don't have to only read the books we recommend. So, all right. No outro music. We're just done. Sound good?
Well, yeah, sure.
All right.
Add it later, I guess, but that's up to you.
Well, no, I'm not, because I'm not doing. If this works, I am going to let the AI edit this for us and put it online. All right.
Good.
It's fun.
All
See you,
right.
man.
See ya.
Bye.